Welcome to Mindset Mondays, the weekly bite-sized podcast designed to build a happier, healthier headspace. Think of it as a learning snack for your morning commute to set your week up right. I'm Mark Holloway, and today's episode is all about curveballs. Now, I want you to think about a moment in your life when everything changed. Not the small, manageable stuff, but a genuine curveball. Something that came out of nowhere or arrived before you were ready and completely upended the plan you had. A redundancy, a diagnosis, a relationship ending, a business failing, a bereavement, a door slamming shut just when you thought you knew which way you were going. Most of us have had at least one of these moments. Many of us have had several. And what these moments reveal, more than almost anything else, is who we actually are. Not who we are when things are going well, but who we are when the plan falls apart. Today's episode is about exactly that. How to handle the curveballs, the moments life throws at you that you didn't see coming and didn't ask for. What the research tells us about resilience, how to respond rather than react, and how to find a way forward, whether that means getting back on track or embracing the entirely new track that the curveball has put you on. Let's get into it. Here's something I think is worth outlining right at the start. We are planning creatures. The human brain is, in many ways, a prediction machine. It constantly builds models of the future, what tomorrow will look like, what next year will bring, who will be in 5 years' time. Planning gives us a sense of control. It organises our energy and our hope. It's genuinely useful. But the plan, however well constructed, is always to some degree fiction. It's our best guess about an uncertain future, dressed up as certainty. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus put it simply: men are disturbed not by things, but by the opinions about things. What he meant was that it's rarely the event itself that undoes us. It's the collision between the event and the story we had about how things were supposed to go. When life throws a curveball, two things happen simultaneously. The external reality changes, and the internal story, the narrative of how your life was supposed to unfold, gets disrupted. And most of our distress comes from the second of those, not the first. This isn't to minimise the real pain of difficult events. Loss is loss, failure is failure, disappointment is real, but understanding that a significant part of our suffering comes from the gap between expectation and reality gives us something to work with. Because while we can't always control the event, we have far more influence over the story than we often realise. Let's talk about resilience, because it's a word that gets used a lot and often misunderstood. Resilience is not toughness. It's not suppressing your emotions, pushing through regardless, or pretending that hard things don't hurt. That's not resilience. That's avoidance wearing a brave face. The scientific definition of resilience is the ability to adapt well in the face of adversity, trauma, threat, or significant stress. The American Psychological Association describes it as less a trait people either have or don't, and more a set of behaviours, thoughts, and actions that can be learned and developed. That's the crucial insight. Resilience is not something you're born with, it's something you build. Dr. Ann Maston, a developmental psychologist at the University of Minnesota and one of the leading researchers in this field, coined a phrase that I think is one of the most important in psychology. She described resilience as ordinary magic. Her decades of research showed that most people who come through adversity well don't do so because of some exceptional superhuman quality. They do so because of ordinary human resources, connection, self-regulation, meaning-making that are available to almost everyone. Ordinary magic? Most of us are more capable of it than we think. The research also consistently identifies several factors that underpin resilient responses to adversity. I want to highlight 3 that are both well supported and immediately applicable. The first is cognitive flexibility, the ability to see a situation from more than one perspective, to hold open the possibility that this difficult thing might also contain something useful, something instructive, something that changes your direction in ways that ultimately serves you. The second is a sense of agency, the belief that your actions can influence outcomes. People who feel that they have some control, even in chaotic situations, recover better than those who feel entirely at the mercy of events. And the third is social connection. The presence of at least one person who believes in you, who shows up for you, who provides what researchers call a secure base from which to face difficulty. The research on this is unambiguous. Isolation makes adversity harder. Connection makes it survivable. When a significant curveball hits, your brain reacts in a very specific way. Understanding that sequence can genuinely help you navigate it. The initial response to an unexpected stressor involves the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, triggering what we commonly know as the fight or flight response. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the system, your thinking narrows, your attention focuses on the threat, non-essential cognitive functions including nuanced, creative, forward-looking thinking temporarily just go offline. This is why the first hours or days after a major curveball can feel almost surreal. You're not processing it clearly. You're not meant to. Your brain is in survival mode. Dr. Bruce Perry, a leading neurologist and trauma specialist, describes this as the brain moving from its higher cortical functions, reasoning, creativity, perspective, down into its more primitive survival centers. He calls this downshifting, and it makes an important point. You cannot engage in nuanced thinking, problem solving, or planning while you're downshifted. You have to let the neurological storm pass first. This is one of the most important practical implications of the neuroscience. In the immediate aftermath of a curveball, the priority is not to fix it, it's to regulate. Breathe, move, sleep, connect with someone safe. Let your nervous system return to a state where your full cognitive capacity is available. Only then can you begin to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. The research of James Pennebaker at the University of Texas also found that expressive writing, simply putting into words what you're feeling and experiencing, significantly reduced the physiological and psychological impact of stressful events. People who wrote about their experiences for 15 to 20 minutes a day for several days showed improved immune function, fewer doctor visits, and better mood outcomes compared to control groups. The act of narrating the experience, giving it shape, sequence, and meaning, is in itself healing. Here's the concept I want to spend some time on, because I think it's genuinely one of the most important and underappreciated ideas in psychology. Most people have heard of post-traumatic stress, but far fewer have heard of post-traumatic growth. The term is coined by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina in the mid-1990s. They were studying survivors of bereavement, serious illness, and other major life disruptions, and they noticed something unexpected. Many people who had come through significant adversity didn't just recover, they reported meaningful positive changes in their lives as a direct result of the struggle. Tedeschi and Calhoun identified 5 domains in which people reported growth after adversity: a greater appreciation for life, deeper, more meaningful relationships, recognition of new possibilities, a greater sense of personal strength and spiritual or existential development, a richer understanding of what life means to them. Crucially, post-traumatic growth doesn't happen despite the suffering, it happens through it. The disruption of your existing framework, your assumptions about how life works, who you are and what matters, is precisely what creates the conditions for a more meaningful reconstruction. This isn't toxic positivity. It's not saying that bad things are secretly good or that you should be grateful for your worst experiences. It's saying that the human capacity for meaning making is extraordinary, and that given the right conditions, people don't just survive their curveballs, they grow through them. The examples here are some of the most powerful I can find, because these people who didn't just cope with curveballs, they were fundamentally shaped by them. Number 1, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison on Robben Island, a curveball of almost incomprehensible proportion. He emerged not broken, but transformed. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, he wrote about how the years in prison gave him time to reflect, to develop patience, to understand his adversaries, and to clarify his position. The prison he was meant to be destroyed by became the crucible in which his leadership was forged. He later said, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul," quoting Invictus, the poem he returned to repeatedly during those years. Number 2, Steve Jobs. He was famously fired from Apple in 1985, the company he had actually co-founded. By almost any measure, this was a catastrophic professional curveball. He described it at the time as devastating, but in his now legendary Stanford commencement address, he reflected that being fired was the best thing that ever happened to him. It freed him to pursue new ventures like Pixar, that gave him new perspectives, new skills, and ultimately brought him back to Apple with the vision and breadth that produced the iPod, iPhone, and iPad. He said, "The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again." Third, J.K. Rowling, whom we have mentioned in earlier episodes, described the period after her first marriage ending as the worst of her life. She was a single mother, living on benefits, dealing with depression. She described herself as a failure by almost every measure she had been taught to value. But she also said, in her Harvard commencement speech, that failure stripped away everything inessential. It forced her to focus on the one thing that mattered to her, writing. The rock bottom, she said, became the solid foundation on which she rebuilt her entire life. And fourth, Nick Vujicic was born without limbs, a curveball he received before he had any say in the matter at all. He has spoken candidly about the despair of his early years, the bullying, the moments he didn't want to continue. Today, he is a global motivational speaker, author, husband, and father. And his message is not that everything happens for a reason, but that you can find a reason to keep going, no matter what you're facing. So what unites all of these people? They were dealt extraordinary curveballs. None of them pretended it was fine, but at some point, after the shock, after the grief, after the processing, they asked a fundamentally different question. Not, why is this happening to me? But, what can I do with this? And that shift in question is everything. I want to briefly introduce a framework that I think is one of the most practically useful mental models for navigating curveballs. It's over 2,000 years old. The Stoic philosophers Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca built their entire philosophy around a single distinction, the dichotomy of control. The idea that everything in life falls into one of two categories. Category 1, things within your control, your thoughts, your responses, your effort, your values. And category 2, things outside your control, everything else, other people's behavior, the economy, your health, the weather, the curveball. Epictetus, who was born a slave and later became one of the most influential philosophers in history, wrote, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic practitioner, wrote in his private journals, the Meditations, about how he prepared himself daily for difficulty, not morbidly, but as a form of readiness, knowing that curveballs were not exceptions to life, but part of it. The Stoic framework doesn't tell you to be emotionless. It tells you to channel your energy into what you can influence and to release what you cannot. It's a radical act of cognitive economy, and the research on locus of control backs it up entirely. Psychologist Julian Rotter's decades of research found that people with an internal locus of control, those who believe their actual actions influence their outcomes, experience better mental and physical health, greater achievement, and more effective coping with adversity than those with an external locus, i.e., those who believe that what happens to them is largely outside their influence. You can't always control the curveball. You can always control your next step. So here are 2 things I want you to try this week. Mindset Shift 1, the Circle of Control exercise. This one comes directly from Stoic tradition, and this has been modernized by coaches and therapists alike. It's simple, powerful, and takes about 10 minutes. Think of a current curveball or challenge in your life, something that's weighing on you, something that feels out of control. Write it down in the middle of a page. Now, draw 2 circles around it. The inner circle is everything about this situation that you can influence. Your response, your next action, who you reach out to, how you spend your energy, what you do today. The outer circle is everything you cannot control. Other people's decisions, the past, external circumstances, what's already happened. Now, and this is the key, make a deliberate decision to stop spending energy in the outer circle. Not because those things don't matter, but because your energy there is wasted. Direct everything into the inner circle. This isn't passive acceptance, it's strategic focus. Every minute you spend on what you can't control is a minute not spent on what you can. This week, whenever anxiety about the curveball surfaces, ask yourself, is this thought living in my circle of control? And if not, what is one thing I can do right now that is? Mind shift 2, the reframe question. At some point this week, ideally when you're feeling settled and clear, not when you're in the middle of the storm, I want you to take the curveball you're dealing with, or one from your recent past, and sit with this question for 10 minutes. If this situation was happening for me rather than to me, what might it be making possible? Not what is it definitely doing, not a forced silver lining, but genuinely what doors might this be opening that weren't open before? What assumptions is it challenging that perhaps needed to be challenged? What capacity in you is it building? What clarity is it forcing? You don't have to land on a tidy answer. The point is to shift the frame from victim of the curveball to someone who is in conversation with it, moving from why is this happening to me to what can I do to fix this? Post-traumatic growth doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people actively engage in this kind of meaning making. You're starting that process now. So let's summarize as we draw this episode to a close. Life will throw curveballs. It always has, and it always will. The plan will fall apart. The ground will shift. Something you didn't see coming will arrive and demand a response. The research tells us clearly that resilience is not a fixed trait, it's a practice. That the human brain can recover from almost anything, given the right conditions. That adversity, navigated with intention, can be a source of profound growth, rather than just something to be endured. The people we talked about today, Mandela, Jobs, Rowling, didn't have different curveballs to the rest of us. They just had a different relationship with them. They regulated, they meaning made, they focused on what they could control, and they stayed in motion. This week, do the circle of control exercise. Ask the reframe question, and remember, the plan was always just a starting point anyway. The most interesting chapters of most people's lives begin where the plan ran out. So, start Monday strong and let that momentum carry you forward. Thank you so much for listening to Mindset Mondays. If this episode meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need it now. And I'll see you next week.